I used to believe silence was a kind of peace. I know now it was just the shape my fear took, dressed up to look like patience. It took me 34 years and one summer to learn the difference, and by the time I understood it fully, I'd already lost more than I realized I was losing. My name isn't the point yet. What matters is the house, my grandmother's house. Technically, though everyone had stopped saying technically out loud, years before she died, because by then it was simply understood that it would come to me. But I should start earlier than the house. I should start with who my grandmother actually was to me, because none of what happened later makes sense without that context. Her name was Odette. She raised me for 4 years when I was a child, between the ages of 6 and 10, during a period my parents don't like to talk about even now. A divorce that turned ugly, a custody arrangement that fell apart, a gap that needed filling quickly. Odette filled it without complaint, without ever once making me feel like an inconvenience she'd absorbed. She taught me to read using the labels on spice jars in her kitchen. She kept a drawer specifically for my school drawings, dated on the back in her careful handwriting, going back 16 years. When I moved back in with my mother at 10, Odette didn't disappear the way some relatives do once their usefulness ends. She kept showing up, every Sunday, for the rest of her life in one form or another. My cousin Theo had a different relationship with her entirely, though for years I didn't see the difference clearly enough to name it. He was 2 years older, lived 3 states away for most of his adult life, and visited on holidays, Christmas, sometimes Easter, always with good wine, always with stories that made her laugh so hard she'd have to put her cup down. I used to feel almost guilty about how much less delightful my visits probably were compared to his. I brought her medication schedules and grocery lists. He brought performance. I didn't understand yet that performance and presence are not the same currency, and that mistaking one for the other is exactly how people like Theo get away with what they get away with. For 11 years, I drove 2 hours every Sunday to sit with her. I want to be specific about what that actually looked like, because vague words like took care of her don't capture the texture of it. I managed her medications, 7 different prescriptions, by the end, organised into a weekly container I refilled every visit. I sat with her through 3 hospitalizations, sleeping in the vinyl chair beside her bed because she was frightened of hospitals, and wouldn't say so directly, just gripped my hand a little tighter whenever a doctor entered. I learned to recognise the difference between her good pain days and her bad pain days by the way she held her coffee cup. I signed the forms nobody else wanted to read closely, power of attorney paperwork, insurance documents, the advance directive that took us both an entire afternoon to get through, because she kept stopping to ask me, half joking, half not, whether I thought she'd made the right choices in her life. Theo used to say, every single visit, the same easy line, delivered with a glass raised slightly, like a toast. Family shows up when it counts. He said it warmly, like it included both of us equally, like presence was something you could bank in large occasional deposits, rather than small weekly ones. I believed it did include us equally. I had no reason yet to hear it any other way. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this story to make myself sound like a saint and him sound like a villain from the very beginning. I loved him too, in the ordinary, uncomplicated way you love a cousin you grew up with. That love is part of why what happened later cut as deep as it did. My grandmother died in March, quietly, in her sleep in the house she'd lived in for 41 years. I found her that Sunday morning. I want to tell you that grief made the next few weeks a blur, because that's usually how these stories go, but it wasn't a blur. It was sharp, almost unbearably clear. I remember the exact colour of the light coming through her kitchen window that morning. I remember calling my mother and not being able to get words out for almost a full minute. I remember, with a precision that still surprises me, every detail of the weeks that followed, including the will reading, which happened on a rainy Tuesday 3 weeks later. The will was straightforward, drafted 8 years earlier, updated once after a minor health scare 5 years before her death. The house to me, her modest savings split evenly between Teo and me, a few specific belongings named individually, her wedding ring to me, a set of woodworking tools to Theo, since he'd shown interest in carpentry as a teenager, and she'd never forgotten it. Nothing complicated. Nothing that should have required a second conversation. The attorney, a calm woman named Priscilla who'd handled Odette's affairs for over a decade, read it aloud in her office, and for about 11 days after that, that was simply how things stood. Theo hugged me after the reading. He said, "She always said you'd earned it. I never once thought otherwise." I believed him completely. Then, 11 days later, he called, warm as ever, and asked to meet for coffee, just to talk through logistics. I remember thinking that was reasonable. Estates involve logistics, insurance transfers, utility accounts, the practical debris of a life that has to be sorted by someone. I had no reason yet to be careful. We met at a small cafe near my apartment, the kind of neutral, comfortable place you choose specifically because it doesn't feel like the setting for anything difficult. He ordered her usual joke order. The most complicated coffee on the menu. She'd have wanted us to be extra about it. And for a few minutes it felt like any other conversation we'd ever had. Then, he told me gently, almost sympathetically, that he'd found an earlier document while going through some boxes at his own apartment, items he said he'd taken from her house months earlier for safekeeping, a detail I didn't think to question at the time. A handwritten note, unsigned, undated, tucked inside an old greeting card, where she'd apparently expressed wanting the house sold and the proceeds split evenly between us. He said he hadn't wanted to make it a legal thing right away. He said he trusted me to do the right thing once I saw it, since we both knew what she really would have wanted, deep down underneath the paperwork, as if the 8 years later formal will, signed, witnessed, and legally executed, was somehow the less authentic document, and a scrap of undated handwriting was somehow the truer one, simply because it was more convenient to his position. I asked to see the note directly. He said he'd photographed it and left the original at his apartment for safekeeping, but he'd send the photo over that evening. It arrived close to 11 at night, a slightly blurry image of handwriting that resembled our grandmother's, but wasn't quite hers. The loops on the lower Ks. Lees were wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name, but felt instantly. The way you feel a wrong note in a familiar song before you can identify which note it actually was. I sat with that photograph for a long time before I did anything at all. Family shows up when it counts. I understood, staring at that photograph at 11 at night, alone in my kitchen, that Teo had never meant that sentence the way I'd always heard it. He hadn't been promising presents. He'd been quietly building a claim, one holiday visit at a time, banking warmth like currency he intended to spend later on something much larger than an afternoon of laughter and good wine. I thought about every Christmas toast, every warm hand on my shoulder at family gatherings, and wondered, the way I imagine most people in my position eventually do, how much of it had been real and how much had been rehearsal. I didn't accuse him. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what came next. I gave him room to simply be grieving and confused, the way people sometimes are, reaching for reasons. A loss makes sense, constructing narratives that soften the hard edges of finality. I told him I needed to think about it. He said, "Of course, take your time, no rush, we're family." The word landed differently than it used to. I spent the following days doing something quiet instead of something loud. I called Priscilla, my grandmother's attorney, and asked, plainly, what the legal standing of an unsigned, undated handwritten note would be against a formally executed will. She told me, plainly back, that it would carry essentially no legal weight on its own in almost any circumstance. But she also told me something that mattered more in the long run, that if Teo tried to formally contest the will using that note, the burden of proof would fall entirely on him to establish its authenticity, its date, and my grandmother's actual intent at the time it was allegedly written. She mentioned, almost in passing, that forensic document examiners exist for exactly this kind of dispute, and that ink composition and paper aging can often establish an approximate time frame. I didn't tell Teo I'd made that call. I let 2 more weeks pass in ordinary quiet, still attending his calls, still speaking warmly, still signing off the way I always had. I wasn't performing peace for his benefit. I was gathering it for my own. Every text message where he'd mentioned the note, every phone call where he'd used the phrase, what she really wanted, screenshotted and dated, the way you'd press a flower before it can fade into something you'd have to take entirely on memory later, something he could later claim never happened quite that way. During those 2 weeks, I also did something else, something smaller but that mattered more to me privately than any legal manoeuvring. I went back through the boxes of my grandmother's letters that were still at the house, the ones Teo hadn't taken, looking for anything in her actual handwriting from the years around when the note was supposedly written. I found birthday cards, a grocery list, a note she'd left me once about watering her tomato plants while she was at a doctor's appointment. I laid them all out on her kitchen table, the same table, where I'd once learned to read from spice, jar labels, and compared the handwriting letter by letter. The L's in her real handwriting curled inward, tight and economical. The L's in the photographed note curled outward, looser, unfamiliar. I wasn't a forensic expert. I didn't need to be. I only needed to trust what I was seeing instead of doubting myself the way I'd spent years doing by default. The turn came when Teo escalated, not to me directly, but around me, which was somehow worse. I learned through a mutual aunt named Colette that Teo had begun mentioning to extended family that I was planning to keep everything and not really honouring what Grandma actually wanted, always delivered with a siege, always sounding like reluctant concern rather than accusation. It was the same architecture as before, just aimed at a wide audience now. Soft-edged, deniable, built carefully to make me look difficult and grasping if I ever pushed back directly, while he got to remain the reluctant, grieving cousin simply advocating for what their grandmother would have wanted. So, I didn't push back directly. I did something he hadn't accounted for, something that used his own strategy against him more effectively than any direct confrontation could have. I asked Colette, the one he'd been quietly speaking to, the one whose opinion mattered most in that side of the family, if she'd be willing to sit with me while I called Priscilla together, on speaker so she could hear directly, in real time, what the actual legal standing of the situation was. No interpretation, no relay, no second-hand version of events filtered through Theo's careful framing. She said yes, a little hesitantly at first, and I understood that hesitation. She didn't want to take sides in what she probably assumed was simply a family disagreement about money. On that call, Priscilla explained clearly what she'd explained to me privately weeks earlier. The will's validity, the formally witnessed signatures, the note's near total lack of legal standing on its own, and the option, if Teo wished to pursue it formally, of a handwriting and forensic document analysis through a certified examiner. Colette asked one question I hadn't specifically prepared for, though I was glad she did, whether such an analysis could also determine roughly when a document was actually written, based on ink composition and paper aging, not just whether the handwriting matched. Priscilla said, in many cases, yes, with reasonable confidence. I never sent that information to Teo directly. I didn't need to. Colette did, in her own words, that same evening, in a message I never saw but heard about later. Apparently gentle in tone, but unmistakably clear in substance. He didn't contest the will. There was no dramatic confrontation, no scene at a family dinner where everyone gasped and understood everything at once, the way these stories sometimes resolve in the retelling. It was quieter than that, and in some ways stranger. He simply stopped mentioning the note entirely, as though it had never existed. 2 months later, at a cousin's engagement party, he made a version of his old toast again. Family shows up when it counts. But this time it landed differently in the room, thinner somehow, like a coat that no longer quite fit the person wearing it. A few relatives exchanged a glance I wasn't meant to catch, but did anyway. I don't know exactly what Colette had said to whom in the weeks between, but something in the room's temperature toward him had shifted permanently. I kept the house. I spent the first few months after everything settled, slowly making it mine in small ways, repainting the kitchen a colour Adette had always wanted, but never gotten around to choosing, keeping her spice jars exactly where they'd always been, finding a strange comfort in cooking dinner some evenings in the same kitchen where I'd learnt to read as a child. I also kept something else, something I hadn't expected to gain from any of it, a much clearer understanding of which relationships in my life had been built on shared history, and which had only ever been built on what I might eventually be worth to someone. Colette and I talk every week now, a closeness that didn't exist before that phone call, one I'm genuinely grateful for, even though I wish it hadn't taken a forged note to create it. Theo and I exchange polite messages at holidays still, warm enough on the surface, thin enough underneath. Both of us know exactly what it's made of now, even if neither of us has ever said so directly, and I suspect neither of us ever will. I think about that first sentence sometimes, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's actually underneath it. Family shows up when it counts. I used to hear it as a promise, something warm and inclusive, extended equally to both of us. Now I understand it was closer to a strategy, one he'd been quietly rehearsing for years, without either of us fully realizing it, waiting for the one moment it would finally count in his favor. He just never accounted for the fact that showing up isn't only measured in holidays and good wine and toasts that make a room laugh. Sometimes it's measured in 11 years of Sundays nobody else wanted, in forms nobody else read closely enough to sign, in a kind of quiet, unglamorous presence that can't be photographed, blurred at the edges or backdated to look like something it never actually was.